Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast in which we explore all things family, specifically how you can build the family of your dreams on your terms. Whether that's through adoption, going through a fertility journey, becoming a solo parent by choice, your chosen family, choosing not to have kids, etc., etc. We explore all of the different constructs of family and the ways that you can create one. This is your host, Julia. I am a solo mom by choice, and I had to go through the process of figuring out what does family mean to me? And that's where this podcast comes from. I am so excited to introduce you to Deb Flashenberg today. Deb is incredible. She is the director of the Prenatal Yoga Center, and she supports people in their pregnancy journey, prenatal, postnatal, everything related to birth and babies. In fact, she has a podcast called Yoga Birth Babies, where she shares birth stories and gives tips and advice and interviews incredible people around the birthing experience. Today, we're going to talk about lots of things. We're going to talk about your pelvic floor and why it's become a cultural norm in the US to have a trashed pelvic floor where we're all just walking around peeing ourselves a little bit and thinking that's okay and normal. We've normalized it in our culture. We're going to talk also about the threshold that you cross when a child enters your life. Whether you're the birthing parent or whether somebody came into your life through a different mechanism, maybe adoption, maybe fostering, maybe you are step parenting, however a child gets into your life, you've crossed a threshold from the before and to the after you. The person that you were before having a child in your life to the person that you are after having a kid, once you become a parent. And this threshold, it's complicated and we can have big, complicated emotions around it. A lot of it has to do with who am I now? What is my new identity? What does parenting feel like? This is confusing stuff. It's a really interesting episode. I highly recommend you take a listen and share it with somebody who might be about to have a baby and needs to think about how to advocate for themselves and to build the right birth plan, or somebody who's just crossed the threshold and is thinking about this whole identity question. Deb is amazing, and if you like this episode as much as I do, don't forget to also sign up for our newsletter, Let's Start a Family on Substack. In the newsletter, we explore all the cultural things that are going on in the family building world right now, anything pertinent, relevant, timely. We also talk a little bit about my experience as a solo parent. It's a great newsletter. If you love Stork'd, you're going to love the newsletter. So without further ado, here's Deb. Deb, I am so excited to chat with you today on Stork'd, the podcast, where we explore the many ways to build and define families. For our audience, we are doing this wonderful podcast swap. First, Deb is going to be on Stork'd, and then we're going to continue the conversation on yoga, birth, and babies. And so this is going to be a really fun, dive deep, dual convo kind of thing. And Deb, if you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself, you've got so much to offer. I'm very curious how you contain all that in a couple of sentence intro.
I thought of that. I'm like, how am I going to keep it small? Super quick. I started as a musical theater performer for years, and then I slid into yoga. And then from that, I started to specialize in prenatal yoga. And then since I hadn't had kids or even had the idea of having kids when I started prenatal yoga, I wanted to learn more. So I became a labor support doula and a childbirth educator, a Lamaze childbirth educator. I went to this place called The Farm and I did a midwifery assistant program. And then I did a pelvic floor teacher training. I just love learning. And when I started my podcast, Yoga Birth Babies, it gave me the chance to find experts in what I wanted to learn about and then have them on the spot to ask questions that I wanted to know the answer to. And along the way, I had 2 kids. I think I did it in a couple sentences.
That's amazing. And I actually was also a trained yoga teacher, although I never taught. I was always afraid. Weirdly, I can stand in front of a boardroom and have board level finance conversations in my day job, and I can stand in front of a mic and have a podcast conversation. But you put me in a yoga studio in front of an audience that's live and like sitting on their mats expectantly, and I just panic. But I think of yoga for many of us as this gateway drug into deep personal life transformation. And it sounds like it was the first step to bring you to where you are now. Tell me
Yeah.
a little bit about that transformative journey.
It was surprising. So I had done yoga through college. I went to Boston Conservatory for musical theater, and I used it more like stretching because I was dancing so much and I am a very flexible body naturally. So I took to it really quickly and really well and confidently because my body could make the shapes. Now, yoga is far more than making the shapes, but it was a way into it. And then when I finally moved to New York, I started to do other shows, and it was a choreographer that actually also used yoga as a warm up. And then I started to look into it a little bit more. And as I got deeper into it, I did find, I called it my mental vacation. So, what I found about yoga is it gave me that spaciousness to get away from all the garbage in my head and all the tasks that we have, especially as parents, we're wearing many hats. And it's just, I felt replenished in a way that I hadn't felt before. So it started as a physical practice, but it really deepened to, sounds so cheesy, but like soul nurturing. I know it sounds so cheesy. I get that. But I felt that it just gave me a break so that when I came out of class, everything was still there, but I was approaching it a little fresher, a little bit more grounded.
Yeah, with so many of these things, yoga, babies, becoming a parent, these life transformations and evolutions, there's no way to describe it but with platitudes. Like, there's no way to describe it but with these terms that sound so trite, but have such deeper meaning personally.
Mhm.
So I get it that when you're saying it, it was just, it was like a soul level need. That sounds funny when you say it out loud, and yet it speaks to what you really needed in your core.
Yeah, and it's funny because sometimes I would feel, not as much, but I used to feel guilty about taking these long classes. Oh, I should be working. I should be doing something else. But what I realized is it really helped me show up better for everyone else if I actually took care of my own needs. So that's why I do prioritize my yoga practice. And that's why I love teaching yoga to parents. I think it's really important for them.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your work? Your podcast is Yoga Birth Babies,
Yes.
and you talked about pelvic floor support, midwifery. You're talking about a lot of concepts that may be foreign to some listeners. So let's break some of those down and talk about what they mean for you in the context of your work.
Sure. So one thing I realized when I went intro, I forgot for the last 20, almost 21 years, I have a yoga studio in New York City on the Upper West Side called Prenatal Yoga Center that I opened in my 20s with a degree in musical theater. So the opposite of most other folks. So my whole world is the perinatal community. So let's break some of this down. So, for about 10 plus years, I was a doula, and that is someone that is hired by a person or a couple. And my job was to support them. I wasn't somebody that the hospital brought in. I was somebody that the pregnant person brought in. And my job was to support them physically, emotionally, with information, and help them advocate for the birth they want and stand by them and help them have the birth that was important to them. Midwifery. Now, I'm not a midwife. I did a midwifery assistant course. Now, a
Mm.
midwife, for those that might be a new term, it's similar to an obstetrician. They are a trained medical professional and they handle the whole trajectory of pregnancy and birth as well person care for someone that is not having a baby. They can still see them for their yearly checkup. So what I did was a brief midwifery assistant course where I'd learned some basic things like if I needed to check blood pressure or a dilation, they even taught us. So it's assisting the midwife. I realized that was not my path. Uh, and yeah, I like being more the emotional support. I didn't want to be responsible for the medical advice. That was a little overwhelming. What other things? Pelvic floor. So, what's exciting is pelvic floor has gotten a lot more popular in the last few years. Pelvic floor physical therapists are all over social media. And the pelvic floor is basically, if you think about the pelvis, the bowl of the pelvis with support, and there's three layers, and it's really the groundedness. If you think of your pelvis from that's the pelvic inlet down to your sit bones, it creates almost like a basket of muscles. And a lot of us, it's really tight and dysfunctional. And what we're looking for is to have a springy, balanced pelvic floor. So if someone is a parent and they sneeze or cough or jump or laugh and they pee themselves, that is a dysfunctional pelvic floor. Now,
Mhm.
your care provider might say, "Oh, that's normal. You had a baby." It's common, but it's not a normal function of your pelvic floor. You should not be peeing yourself.
I think it's I don't know, maybe a reflection on where I'm misspending my time. A lot of my information comes from Instagram these days. And
I
so,
know.
right? And so every once in a while you see a meme or a reel or something on social media that sort of changes your perception about what you held to be a truth.
Mhm.
And so I saw something recently where someone was saying that in the US, we have these jokes about moms who laugh and pee themselves.
Yeah.
And that the other countries, particularly European countries, don't understand those jokes because pelvic floor therapy is part of their postnatal care. And
I
so they
know.
don't pee themselves when they laugh. So that this biological thing that we take to be a granted, something that is true for all women who have had babies, whether or not they've delivered through cesarean or through vaginal births, actually isn't a given. It,
No, it should not be.
so yeah, that kind of blew my mind. As I understand it, if I'm just going to put it in like super layman's terms, for those people who have vulvas and uteruses, sometimes they need a little extra help to function properly, particularly after
Yes,
having a baby. And this
absolutely.
peeing and sneezing thing is something a pelvic floor therapist can help with.
Absolutely. Yeah. They can assess and talk about, is your pelvic floor tight? Is your pelvic floor tight and strong? Is your pelvic floor tight and weak? And they can assess where the individual needs some rehab. So after my first birth, which was epic, very long, my pelvic floor is pretty trashed. And I saw a pelvic floor physical therapist that I told her, she was like Humpty Dumpty. She like put me back together. And she really helped me understand and rehab. And that really sparked my desire to understand the pelvic floor better, which is why I went on to do a pelvic floor teacher training and a prenatal postnatal exercise corrective specialist training so that I can offer some of this guidance to my students that come in. Because you're like you're saying, it's totally like a meme, a joke, and I know we're going to talk about things that I'm hoping will change in our healthcare. And I think it's respect for postpartum and women's bodies and anyone that has a uterus and a vulva and a pelvic floor that needs support. Literally
Yeah.
needs support.
So let's talk. We're talking a little bit about what these terms mean, but let's talk about what they can mean for you. Your career is in supporting people who are pregnant, who are giving birth, who are postnatal.
Yep.
Now, if you're a birthing person and you're going into this, maybe it's your first time, maybe it's your fourth, or who knows, what are some of the things that you might be thinking about to advocate for yourself and for your needs?
Oh, that's such a good question. I guess the first thing is that you want to advocate for a team that really respects your choices of birth. I guess the first step for that pregnant person is to think, what are my values about and what are my choices and what kind of birth do I want and where do I feel safest? So I think once they establish that, then they can start to build a team around that. So something that comes to my mind is I had a student, she was for New York City, she was on the younger side, she's in her early 30s. Most of our folks are like 34, 35, 36, up to 40. Um, so she was on the younger side. I'm a teenage bride, like kind of in New York. And she was low risk, healthy, and she had been seeing for regular yearly checkups a great doctor who she really liked, but it was a high risk doctor. And what she realized is her high risk doctor was treating her like a high risk person when she wasn't. So that's going to change how her birth would have been managed. She eventually changed care providers. So thinking about what do you foresee? What's the kind of birth you want as the pregnant person? So if you want something more low intervention, the first thing to do is find a care provider who's going to practice that way.
Mm.
And then make sure if you have that, then okay, what's their birth philosophy? Are they listening to you? Are they rushing you aside? There was a study, I don't have it off the top of my head, but I remember there it was saying the average OB appointment is like 6 to 7 minutes. They go in, they do the vitals, they check everything, ask questions, and out. And you may feel pretty rushed in that. And a lot of folks don't want that. So then they may want to look at a different type of care practice, which is tends to be midwifery, tends to give those longer, more patient oriented appointments. So I guess that's going back to your question of ways to advocate and think about yourself is what do you want for your birth and finding a team that's going to support that. It's a
Mm.
very roundabout. I hope I got
No,
the
I,
answer.
I think that's actually really helpful because it starts from an intention setting early
Yes.
on.
Yeah, I think that holds true. Like you said, the intention from the beginning of getting your birth team, the intention of how you want to be supported during pregnancy, the intention of what you need postpartum and having those needs met.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So I think it's fascinating because you have this practice that supports people at all levels of the birth experience. So you can contextualize your work within the big picture of what's happening for birthing people in the US
Mhm.
right now, which is a lot. There's a lot going on for birthing people. When you think 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, do you have a hope for what the state's culture around the birth experience might be? Like, what are we aiming for? What would be the ideal way to shape the American focus on birthing people?
The first word that literally popped into my head was respect.
Mm.
And that can be in so many directions. That can be respect for people's choices that may be different than ones. We don't have to agree, but we shouldn't, in my opinion, tell people how to get pregnant, to keep that pregnancy, to if there should be or shouldn't be a parent. So I think that's one part of respect. I think also respecting someone's body. One thing that really shocked me. So maybe 2 years ago, I was starting. So I'm working on what's called a Spinning Babies. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
heard of that organization. So I'm doing their parent educator. And part of that was doing an initial workshop. I showed up, it was somewhere in Pennsylvania. And I showed up. I thought there'd be all other yoga teachers and stuff, but I was the only yoga teacher, and they were all labor and delivery nurses, which I thought was great because this is a great system to learn. But something one of the L&D nurses said was she realized now after this, I think it was like a 5 hour course, the importance of informed consent and consent to touch. And she'd actually been brave enough to say, in the past, she saw the birthing person just as a body and that she had the right to go in and touch without asking because her job was to do check monitors, get blood pressure, draw blood, whatever touching needed to be done to do her job. And after that workshop, she realized that you should always say, "May I touch you?" And that the person has a right to say yes or no. So that's another level of respect
That is
that,
such a powerful example. Thank you for sharing that.
yeah, I was shocked, but I thought it was really brave of her to admit that. So another part of respect is when someone's in the medical system, respecting their wishes. And as we were preparing as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about some of the birth trauma I had witnessed as a
Mhm.
doula. And two examples, and it's funny, there are two different people that will be ever seared in my brain. They both had episiotomies without conversation,
Mm.
as well as without anesthesia. So I don't know how the second one I do remember how,
Mm.
because the care provider came in was not the main care provider and thought that my client had an epidural. So she snipped a episiotomy. So if anyone's what's that is a surgical cut at the perineum to make the vaginal opening larger. And my client screamed, imagine vaginal opening, someone cutting it, and you
Without.
don't have any. So even if someone didn't have an epidural, what they would do is they put local anesthesia there. They have little shots and put local so it numbs it. And that actually happened twice. That happened to one client and then a different client. And that is an example of birth trauma. And what the woman I'm thinking of now, I remember we'd spoken about it after her husband was traumatized. It was a traumatic experience. And that was because there was not a conversation about we'd like to do this. Had it been brought up, she could have said, wait, I'm totally unmedicated. Had it been a conversation. So that's an example of of uninformed consent. And that's, I think, disrespectful when the care provider obviously they weren't meaning ill intent. Their job was thinking, I got to get this baby out. But they were looking at a vagina and not thinking there's somebody above it. And
Mhm.
they have a right to say yes or no. They have a right to, even if it's a quick conversation, we're going to do an episiotomy. We need to put I think it was a vacuum extraction. And then my client could have said no or sure, but please before you my perineum. So I think respect is lacking on so many levels. And then respect of postpartum, I feel like our country does not do a good job. We already talked about we don't have that physical therapy afterwards that many other countries do, but we also don't have any sort of mat leave for maternity leave for a lot of
Yep.
places.
Yep.
Paid, there's an expectation for people to just be able to do it all on their own. So I'd like to see a lot of changes, but I think the first one has to be respect for the whole family unit and birthing process and postpartum. So I guess it goes back to the whole family experience.
Yeah, I think it's so important, and it's important to take the context of the birthing person's body and having autonomy over their body, having consent over their body, and then broadening it to, like you mentioned, the partner who witnessed
Oh my God, that was
their
awful.
person in pain. But also, when we're talking about maternity leave, we're also talking about paternity leave. And there's been some recent studies that paternity leave has a huge impact on child outcomes later on. College admittance levels, graduation rates, things like that can be traced as early as the first weeks, whether or not the second parent has leave. It's amazing. So, when you're talking about respect, I think that's such a perfect word to describe the whole birthing experience and that whole experience of bringing a child into your life
Hmm.
and transitioning then into adulthood, into parenthood is really it's an important thing to respect. It's an important moment of transition.
Absolutely. And it's a hard moment. I remember doing a birth where the client really was overwhelmed at the idea of that. She said during her birth, she was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to cross this threshold. Am I ready? And it was terrifying for her.
It is a threshold. It really is. And so, what is your experience in supporting people in crossing that major threshold? What are some of the things that you've noticed in people as they cross from one state of being to the next state of being?
I think if for a lot of people it's fear, which is totally normal because it is a huge thing. I think from my own experience, I remember crossing that threshold. So I chose to do a home birth. And I remember being in my house going through this very long birth. And then a couple of days later, I think my mother-in-law was there and she wanted to go across the street and get your nails done. And I remember coming out of my apartment building. So I was living on the Upper West Side in New York City and coming out and being like, I look the same, a little bit rugged, a little bit tired, a little greasy, but for the most part, I look the same. But inside, does everyone know what I just did? I
Mhm.
just went through this massive ordeal and transformation, and I have a baby, and my body is a wreck, and I'm tired. Does anyone know what I just did? And yet I looked more or less the same. So that's something I think about when my students come back, that this huge transition happens internally that a lot of people may not recognize. And I think that transition is a lot about not just the ordeal of giving birth, but that new role, as well as a little bit of a mourning of a loss of the
Mm.
freedom before having a child. Like getting out of the house, the newborn is not
Yeah.
just throw your shoes on, grab the keys, let's go. Like it is a whole lifestyle change. And I think there is that transition of a freedom carefreeness to the responsibility. And it's a lot of internal work. I think how one sees themselves changes. Maybe somebody left a job that they really felt respected at and proud of, and they're now in a different role, and that role can feel very challenging. Having a newborn is like completely giving up any control. Like you think you have control, but
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
don't. So yeah, I think it's just a transition internally that is not always seen from the outside.
For some reason, the word authenticity is coming up for me.
Oh, I like that.
And authenticity is where the outsides meet the insides, the
Mhm.
two match. And these days, encouraged to be our most authentic selves, to show up and say, this is who I am, and really make sure that you're broadcasting externally the person you are inside. And I think that's an amazing movement, but it can be really confusing when you've crossed this threshold and all of a sudden your outside, as you said, is the same and your inside's totally reorganized. And suddenly there's like an authenticity crisis. Who am
Mhm.
I? How am I
Yeah.
showing up? Why are you reacting to me as though I'm the same person? I am not the same person. And I think I felt that authenticity confusion probably for the first year, maybe a little bit more of my son's life. Okay, I am not who I was, but I am who I am or was. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of, yeah, it's the who am I? I think that
Mm,
happens a lot. Who am I? What are my priorities? What are my roles? I think, and there's a word, so matrescence, going from that maid into motherhood, using kind of gender terms there. But it is like you said, it's a huge transformation. But I like your understanding of authenticity. That really
mm.
resonates with me.
It's an interesting conversation. I think we're all struggling to figure out our identity. And then this thing happens, and it can be traumatic or it can be beautiful or it can be complicated or whatever it is. And then you're left for the rest of your life figuring out what just happened. Right?
I would say that's very accurate. I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I'm still on a regular basis saying, what just happened?
Totally. And I'll tell you, I'm 40, and my mom every year on my birthday talks to me about her birth trauma. This is what happened when I had you, and it was horrible, and it was wonderful, and all the things. And she goes through in vivid detail her birthing experience with me. And I always thought it was weird. Okay, I know the story. I don't need to hear about it again. And now I understand that you're constantly living in this moment that you cross from one point to the next. That threshold moment is so poignant that even 40 years later, it's going to resonate.
Oh, my mom tells me, you're from Boston, you'll appreciate this. She's, you were almost born on steroid drive. I've been hearing that for a long time.
So, for those people who are not from Boston, Storrow Drive is an iconic two-lane mini highway, which is
Often crowded.
very crowded. It winds through the city and it has these bridges over it. And every September, there's something called getting Storrowed, which is not having a baby on the side of the road. By the way, there are no shoulders on Storrow, so that would have been very dangerous. But getting Storrowed is when you have a moving van and you don't pay attention to the ceiling heights of these bridges and you get stuck. And
And all the college kids are
all the
coming in.
closest, or in your case, getting Storrowed would have been to be born in an unsafe but iconic location.
Because I've heard that story for years. Because it's still part of my mom's identity.
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh. I can imagine how terrifying that must have been. You started the conversation by saying, think about where you feel safest in your delivery and
Probably not steroid drive.
not Storrow Drive. Mm-mm. No, not at all. You chose to have a home birth. Did you choose two home births? You said you have two.
I did. I
Mhm.
did. So it was interesting. I wasn't expecting when I first went into doula work to eventually end up with home births. At the time when I started Prenatal Yoga Center, there was a freestanding birth center called Elizabeth Seton. And so it was a freestanding, and if anything happened, it was attached to this other hospital or related to this other hospital, St. Vincent's. Now, as I was getting closer to having my own kids, that closed. And there was a birth center at a hospital not far from where I was living. But as a doula, I saw that very few people actually made it into the birth center. There's 3 birthing suites. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, for whatever reason, they didn't have a nurse there or usually it's staffing. So then they were up in labor and delivery, which as a tool, I respected what it was for. But I also saw that it did feel a little bit like a factory, like they want to get you in and out. And they have
Mhm.
some schedule restrictions, like you can push for this long, even though ACOG, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, that is ridiculous to have this small window. You can labor for this amount of time. It's often are introducing Pitocin. And that is not what I wanted for myself. I didn't want to be in a hospital gown, a lot of people coming in and feeling cold. And it was not what I wanted. So if I had my ideal birth, it would have been a birth center because I liked the idea of not just being in my home, but having that home like parameters. And I like the idea of having a staff if we needed, but I didn't really trust I'd actually get to use the birth center.
Yeah.
So by default, I did have a wonderful birth team. I interviewed my home birth midwives. I wanted to make sure that it was just someone that I felt really safe, that I trusted, that answered the questions I had properly, like what I needed for them to say. And so I had a doula, I had a midwife, and there was a midwifery assistant and my husband. And we gave birth both times on the Upper West Side of New York City in our apartment.
My sister did the same thing in New York. And I think for her, it was a very powerful experience to be in an environment that she felt safe in and controlled over.
Yeah.
And it's amazing with all the education that you have around birthing experiences, how you were able to parse out this is what I want, this is what I don't want, and really find and identify a solution that's right for you.
Yeah, and I was really also very lucky that I had a relationship, and I still do. It's the same, believe it or not, the same OB the same gynecologist I had since my early 20s. He was our backup. So I did have an extra safety net that if things look like I needed to transfer, I wasn't going to just go into the emergency room or just present myself at labor and delivery. My OB was going to meet us there. So I had that extra security that I'd be taken care of and respected no matter where I was giving birth.
And let's acknowledge that some of these tools, birthing centers, midwives, doulas, even choosing your medical doctors and choosing your care providers comes with a certain amount of privilege. Not
Absolutely.
everyone gets that. And that's the sad fact about having babies in the US is that so many of us don't get to choose our care team. We go into the
No.
emergency room and we're assigned somebody because of socioeconomic stuff or because of
Yes.
the geography and we may be living in a more rural area where there's only one option or because we're in an emergency situation. Do you have any advice for somebody who is hoping to construct a birth that feels safe and authentic to them
Mhm.
and may not have the financial resources to build the team that they want?
Yeah, I would say they may not be able to hire a doula, although I do know there are some doula agencies that have not just sliding scales with pro bono work. I do know I actually believe it's in Boston. There's a hospital that does have doulas on staff. So I do think that, and that's exciting. I think that I'm hoping that becomes like a thing more often. Having a birth partner, and it doesn't have to be a romantic partner, it could be a best friend, a sister, a mother, an aunt, someone that you, as the birthing person, can rely on to have your back and advocate for you. Because when you're in labor, we don't want, and our bodies won't function well in labor if we're too much in our thinking mind. So we need this hormone called oxytocin to flow really well. And that's what contracts the uterus. And when the uterus isn't contracting because of our body producing oxytocin, that's this thing, the synthetic form of oxytocin called pitocin, which
Hmm.
is used in like, I'd say close, probably, I'm going to guesstimate like 90 to 95 births, if not percent births, if not more. So if we're having anxiety and fear and our bodies, our hormonal blueprint is not doing what it's supposed to, the adrenaline's going up, the oxytocin's going down, we're going to get pitocin. So having somebody advocate, not the person giving birth again,
Hmm.
advocate, I think that can be the first step in feeling respected and heard. And that could just literally be somebody saying, is this medically necessary? Is this just routine intervention? Just asking the questions and holding that space. So it could be, again, a friend, a sister, a cousin, taking the time for like for the two people on the birth team, if they're not hiring someone else, to educate themselves about options. And then it takes a lot of bravery to ask those questions. It's not easy to present yourself against a medical authority and ask those questions. So I guess the education is the first step. And I guess the first step is finding somebody you trust to have your back and then educating. And what's been amazing with the pandemic is so much more is online and there's a lot of free services out there. There's a lot of sliding scale low cost services. There's on demand where you don't have to show up at the same time. So I think that can help those because you were 100% right. It is a privilege to be able to
Hmm.
choose or change care providers. It is a privilege even to decide, wow, I can have different hospitals to choose. It's not something that a lot of folks have that opportunity to do.
Yeah, and something that I've heard from a lot of OBGYNs, nurses, doulas, midwives, et cetera, is having the advocate. And I'll give you an example from my own birth experience. While I did have advocates in the room, I was really confused about what an epidural should feel like. I chose to have a medicated birth in a hospital, and the epidural wasn't kicking in. And I just didn't understand that, like, it was supposed to feel different. And the nurse kept looking at me and saying, "You're in pain. You need to advocate for yourself." And then finally, she told my mom, who was in the room with me, "I am not allowed to tell the doctor to do this differently. I'm a nurse. I'm not allowed to say to the doctor, you have to redo the epidural. So you guys have to ask for that." And not a lot of nurses would step over the line and say that. But
Yeah.
it puts a framework around, you think that the medical care providers in the room with you, the nurses and the doctors, have your best interest at heart, and they do. And there are certain things that they're prohibited from
Yes.
asking for or doing on your behalf.
Yeah, even as a doula, I could not say that. I could advocate for my client, or if my client had a partner, for them to say, hey, because I've seen that. I had a client that the epidural just wasn't working because the pain she was having
Yeah.
looked like, I've been to enough births at that point to look like an unmedicated birth. I'm like, but you have an epidural. And so it shouldn't be perceived this way. And so I could not say the same thing the nurse did. So I had to have the husband step in and say, can we have the doctor check out to make sure everything's okay? And what happened was the medication was dripping down her back. It wasn't going through the catheter and into her spinal area.
Oh my goodness. So I want to go back to one or two things, and I'll
Sure.
actually give you the choice. You've written about fear in the past, fear
Yeah.
about birth, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what fears people have going into a birth experience.
Yeah. This is something, it's funny. I actually just released a reel yesterday about this. So the birth I actually alluded to earlier about the woman who was scared to cross the threshold. I think that was my fifth birth as a doula. So I was very new. It was a really challenging birth. She was, I think, 40 or 41. It was her husband's second marriage, and she knew that this is like her one chance to have the birth that she wanted. And she really built it up. And she was not having that birth. It was not what was unfolding. So a year later, she called me to talk, and I was terrified. And that's when she realized that she did not want to cross that threshold. It was terrifying to her.
Mm.
So it taught me a lot that I started to talk to my clients about what are some of their fears. Not that I was going to solve them, but it could at least early before labor shine some light on some things that could come up. Because as I already talked about, when we have a lot of fear, the body's going to react. And that fight or flight is not, we need the body to be in the parasympathetic nervous system, more that, not that it's relaxing, but not in the fight or flight where we're not, the body's just not ready to give birth. So if you're in that fearful place, the body's not going to be ready to give birth. So I talk to my clients about, think about what are your fears? And some common themes were, I'm afraid I can't do this. I'm scared of the pain.
Do this the birthing or do this the parenting?
Both.
Hmm.
I'm afraid I can't. And they hit that crisis of confidence. I don't think I can do this. So it was I don't know if I can go, I don't know if I can handle the pain of labor. I don't know if I can push the baby out. Sometimes it was, I'm scared of pooping while pushing, because that happens. It really does. The nurses are experts at sweeping it away. You'll never even know it's there. Some were saying, I'm scared of my partner seeing me like this. I'm scared of the sounds I'm going to make. I'm scared of losing control of myself, because birth, medicated or unmedicated, there is a surrendering. I'm scared of what it's going to be like to raise a child. I'm scared of loss of identity. I'm scared of what this is going to do to my body. I'm scared this can hurt my baby. I'm scared of dying. Like, I've heard all of this. And I think when you can at least get it out and talk about it, and you may not resolve it, but by bringing it into the light, I think people can address it. And I remember having one client who was really scared of the pain, and her husband thinking less of her about it. And so we had a little key word that when she got that way, I'd like whisper in her. I don't remember what I said. I wish I could, but I don't remember what I said to her. But I was like whispering something to her, some sort of affirmation or give her courage. And so we had like a little back and forth. And that helped her. So again, not that we can remove the fear, but we can at least address it so it's not paralyzing.
So if
So
I'm
that's
going
what I think.
to be so bold as to amend an earlier statement of yours,
Okay. Yeah.
you had said that the best thing to do is to think about intention setting and thinking about what kind of birth experience you have as you're mapping out your next steps when you're starting out. It sounds to me like maybe doing that in tandem with an exploration of your fears might be
Oh,
really useful.
definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And having those around you, part of it. Like I had another client that had some trauma, and I was her doula for a second birth. Her first birth was really fast, and I believe the pushing stage was very overwhelming. So we had identified that she actually changed care providers at 38 weeks, which was very late in
Oh,
pregnancy. And she
yeah.
hired me like a few days after that. So it was like a Russian job. And what her care provider knew, so she brought those fears up. And so her care provider did a pudendal nerve block. So while she was in the birth center, she did, I don't totally understand everything. So feel free, those listening, to look it up or Google it. But I believe it's just like a numbing at the pudendal nerve in the vagina, so that when she did get to that pushing stage, it wasn't so overwhelming. So she addressed the fear and then found a care provider that respected it and found a way to help her through that fear.
That word respect again.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Having seen as many births as you have and coached people through the portal, through the threshold, through that transformative moment in your yoga center, which is designed to support women at this phase, how do you define family? How does your work inform the way in which you think about the family unit?
Oh, that's such a good question. And what do I think about the family unit? I was going to say it's intentional, but it's not always intentional. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's accidental. But I guess when we go back to respect, it's about respecting those that you choose to bring into that family, partnered, unpartnered, love, respect, protection. I call it circling the wagons, when you really hold that space of family unit and really nurture those within it. So that's what I think of family. I think of my own family as when things are tough, we have to circle the wagons and support each other. I think the same thing when you're creating a family, you're not necessarily choosing, because sometimes you don't necessarily have a choice who shows up in your family, but I think there is something sacred about supporting one another for those that are there for each other.
I like that. That sacred circle, that circling the wagons. It's really special. If we are interested in learning more about your work, maybe visiting your yoga center, maybe checking out some of the information that you provide, the educational tools and resources, where do we find you?
I'm everywhere under Prenatal Yoga Center. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Prenatal Yoga Center. You can do our classes in studio or online. We have online prenatal classes every day. PrenatalYogaCenter.com. And my podcast is called Yoga Birth Babies. And I think I've had it 7 years and I've had over 300 guests. And it's much fun for me to interview people as it is for the community to get to listen to the experts speak. So find it at Prenatal Yoga Center.
Awesome. Guys, I definitely recommend you check out all of the tremendous resources that Deb and Prenatal Yoga Center have. And stay tuned, check out her podcast, where I will be joining Deb just in a few moments. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.